Good evening, and welcome to Naples United Church of Christ here in what we were just talking about, warm Naples, Florida. I was just about to say that on a weather app that I was looking at today, it started showing 3 digits for the first time of anticipated about how it will feel.
The heat index.
Yeah, heat index, and I thought, oh yeah, here we are. So, but it's great to be here and to be with wonderful friends and colleagues. And Sharon, we were just celebrating that you got to see some family for the first time in quite a while. And so I know it was good to see them.
Saw my grandchildren and my parents. So
yeah, talk about intergenerational.
Yes.
But it's I know it was good for you, but it's wonderful for us to have you back. So, Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, our assistant minister, and Reverend Dr. Deb Kaiser-Cross, our Minister for Congregational Care. And I'm laughing because I'm eager to hear about life's next chapters, because we will be celebrating your retirement. You don't actually physically leave us for a few more weeks.
It's the long goodbye.
Yes. Yeah. I remember, growing up as a preacher's kid, we would sometimes have a long farewell. And one time my dad had a move that literally we announced it one Sunday. We had a goodbye, or we had one Sunday, and then the goodbye Sunday was the next Sunday. It was a last minute move that the bishop made. And it really was this kind of crazy move. But there was something nice about we didn't have to do the long goodbye. It was just this there we go.
It's a wonderful thing for all of us. It's a good way to transition, but it's hard to say goodbye to people you really care about.
Yeah, and it's
it
hard.
Really is.
Yeah, I definitely get that. Well, and as we get started, I certainly want to say thanks to Brad, our director of production, and Alex, who's a member of our production team, for making us look as good as we can look tonight. And of course, Wendy, our executive assistant, who I swear she didn't take flower arranging, but she makes these things happen, and then just gets all of our ducks in a row, and so I'm grateful for that. And as I already mentioned, this Sunday we're celebrating Deb's retirement. She will be preaching both services, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of your family who will be with us, and we'll have receptions at both services. And I just want to remind people that worship, we still require reservations for worship because of social distancing, but the receptions will be in the gathering place, which is our outdoor courtyard area. And because it's outdoor, we don't have to have reservations for that. So even if you want to see Deb and wish her well, if you're not going to be here for worship, you can still come by for either reception, and I know we look forward to celebrating that. And then, of course, we'll be back next week, Clergy Roundtable, chapters 9 and 10. And are you doing
I'm doing
those?
next week.
That's what I was thinking. Are there any other announcements? When I was writing this out, I thought, I know there's lots going on, but I didn't know if there was anything else we needed to highlight. Well, this is, in my opinion, these are some pretty robust chapters with lots of good stuff to dig into. So I'm more than happy to dive in. Again, it's great to be together. So chapter 7, again, we're studying Love is the Way, Holding on to Hope in Troubling Times by Bishop Michael Curry. I was actually telling a friend about this book today in a brief conversation over lunch, and this is how I introduced Bishop Curry. I said, well, you'll remember he was the one who preached Harry and Meghan's wedding, and I think he is probably, although he's probably happy to be known that way, but I think he will forever be identified and known that way. But again, this is turning into one of my favorite books. I mean, I really am enjoying the book tremendously. Chapter 7, each chapter has a title and then a question to answer. So chapter 7, leave no one behind. And the question is, I'm told to love my neighbor, but who is my neighbor? And so he spends quite a bit of time at the beginning of the chapter outlining his time so this is my language. He doesn't use this language, which I think might be something for me to learn here. He details ministry at St. James Episcopal, which I would call an inner city church, meaning a lot of times there's actually seminary programs now for what they call urban ministry, And he really talks a lot about how churches are often will sell their plants campuses in the city and move to suburbs. That's often very tempting. And he just talks about how St. James was rooted in the downtown part of Baltimore. And then he talks about both the challenges and the blessings of that ministry. This is not on our list of questions, but I was thinking back about your ministries, and I can't say with certainty that I know. Have you served urban settings? Okay, so
I did, believe it or not, there's this thing called CPE for clergy, clinical pastoral education. It almost always happens in hospitals or care facilities. But I happened to do one that was in the inner city of Cincinnati.
Oh, okay.
So I worked in, at the time it was over the Rhine, which was, if you know
Yeah.
Cincinnati, it's a beautiful area. At the time it was, you know, a lot of homelessness, a lot of people who are dealing
But
with
that's
addiction.
a clear distinction in the city, right?
Yeah, it's called Over the Rhine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a really lovely area. But anyway, at the time it was not, it was a tough, so it was a very short time, but that was my experience.
Okay. And Sharon,
No.
okay, I didn't think so, and I didn't think about your CPE time, so, okay. And I have not, so I've been either, my previous church perhaps might be considered in the city, but certainly not as Bishop Curry describes. And then in this chapter, he sets up, based on the work of Martin Buber, which I know I stuck my head in your office last week and asked if you had read any of Buber's work. Had you? Yeah. So I have not, but I actually learned, in case anyone's interested, actually Deb taught me that the book that this work comes from is available on Audible. If you have the Audible Premium membership or whatever it's called, you can download it for free. So I've downloaded it. I haven't started listening to it yet. About I, thou. And this is what he says about it, which to me, it really brought it to life on page 144. He says this: thou recognizes the other as an active subject, a human spirit whose truth can be understood only through a relationship. You can't own a thou. You can't stereotype a thou. You can't ignore a thou. You can't throw a thou away. And so for me, I likened it to a covenantal relationship that we talk about in the Bible, that there's more equality in that versus different types of relationships. And so I'll admit, this is the first that either I've heard of I, thou, or that I remember hearing about I, thou.
This may be a generational thing.
Okay.
Because it was certainly something that we talked about in seminary.
Well, I'm certainly familiar with Martin Buber, but again, I had not read complete works of his, probably only papers or references to him. So you're right, and it might be generational in seminary. And so that was my question: is this new concept to you all, and does it resonate?
It definitely does. I mean, there are a couple of things. I was familiar with them, but kind of like you, I'm not sure I ever read the whole work. I know I've read portions of it, so I understood the I-thou approach. Plus, I went to a Quaker seminary, and Quakers really would not use, well, actually, they do use thou language. Thee and thou, I mean, that's
I was
where
going to say,
that
that's
came,
what, yeah, okay.
That sense of, they're always looking for that of God in every human person. And so even when they came to this country, they called each other thee and thou, because it was to recognize the sacredness of the other person. So that resonates with me. And the other part that I was really struck by in that chapter is when he talked about, there's also I-it relationships. And that's what we've been talking about in previous weeks, about how we other,
Yeah.
Right.
make people other and less than. And so I-thou is the correction for I-it.
Yeah, and I think, I think that was what really struck me, is that it really, in my opinion, is so intentional about trying to take away the othering that we do. Yeah.
Well, and I want to be clear, I've not read the entire works either, but I was familiar and had read about this concept. And I've always liked it, and I had the same thought that the I, it is exactly what we've talked about in terms of making the other into somebody different that we can't relate to. One of the things that I had not remembered that he talked about was that the I, it makes me God.
Yes, I
Makes
remember
me the
that.
supreme being because
Okay.
I think I'm better than the it. And I really hadn't thought about that, but when it's the I, thou, that there is the covenantal relationship, the sense that I recognize in you the image of God, and you see in me the image of God, how different that is, and it is a much needed correction in our world.
Yeah, and that idea, the imago Dei, the recognizing God in one another, I think is such a powerful spiritual tool that, frankly, we sometimes lose sight of, especially when we do the othering. When that becomes the dominant factor,
Right.
which, frankly, I think we've kind of been struggling with in our society lately.
Yeah.
And then, so that was on page 144. And then on page 145, I think this is, you'll see in my notes that I think this is like the most, at least so far, the most profound page in the entire book. It just struck me between the eyes in two different ways. And interestingly, he's quoting two other people, but I think they're just such profound ideas. The first, he quotes the late Bishop Edmund Browning, who was a former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, who in 1985 said this: "I want to be very clear. This church," meaning the Episcopal Church, "is open to all. There will be no outcasts." And I thought, wow, let's just put that on every church stationery. And then he goes on to quote a former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, who was arguing for the protection of Jews from the Nazis during World War II, who was known to say, "The church is the only society that does not exist for the good of its own members." So again, I find these to be two deeply profound statements, and they could radically change some churches, and they could radically end some pastors' careers very quickly, depending on the pastor and depending on the church. So just because I reacted to them does not mean that everyone does or that you would, but how did you react? And perhaps a deeper, scarier question in some ways, how would you hold up those as measuring sticks to the ministries of Naples United Church of Christ?
Well, I think I would agree with you, they're profound. They're two different themes,
Yeah.
so maybe I would talk about one at a time. This notion, to me, it's interesting that it was in 1985 that this quote about being open to all, there will be no outcasts, because I think we've been able to say that for a long time. We still can't live it. I mean, or we're still not able to fully live into it. Now, who the outcasts were may have changed.
Yeah, and he does not give a greater understanding of that quote. And I didn't take the time to try to track it down about if that was during a general church address or something about what that was geared toward.
But I think there was a time when there were few churches that were at least openly welcoming to gays and lesbians, and we'll talk more about that. But now the United Church of Christ is very clearly open and affirming, and gays and lesbians are not outcasts. In principle, I don't know that they always feel as welcomed as we would want them to, but I'm quite sure that here or anywhere, there are still people who could come in and not feel like they fit in or like they're fully welcomed. And whether that's immigrants, whether that is people who are extremely poor, or people who are very conservative and they come in and they don't feel very welcomed by a progressive theology. I mean, even if progressive theology says you're welcome. And I think this is, for me, the heart of the gospel, and it is a life journey as an individual and as a church to get there.
Yeah, for sure.
And I would say that we could probably talk about both of them separately, but I think we're responsible for making a welcoming environment as a church. Sometimes people don't feel welcomed, partly because of how we may be insensitive even if we're trying, but partly because they may be carrying some baggage. And I think it's really important to help identify that and to try to be open to conversations with people with curious questions. And I'm thinking in particular, people who might have a different theology who would walk in here. They may feel really welcome because they've been to a social event, or they really love that we're involved in the community, and then walk in and go, I don't know what I think about that. And I think the role of us and other people is to invite conversation so that a sense of welcome can really be felt by people. So,
Yeah, I just agree wholeheartedly with what you, with both of you and what you're saying, and Deb, what you were saying resonates really with me about, I think for people to feel welcome, they have to feel safe. And you can't make someone feel safe, but you can create places, I hope. One of my goals is to create places where people can feel safe, and I think one of those cornerstones is where people can have conversation and bring questions and baggage and doubts and fears and things. Because, you know, I think churches historically have been so, pardon the term, hell-bent on telling people, well, you can bring your different thoughts, your different questions, as long as they fit within our parameters.
and I gotta be honest, I mean, fundamentalists can do it and progressives can
Sure.
do it.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah,
I think
yeah.
it's really important to know that, to not have blind spots ourselves on how we are creating a less than welcoming atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think one of the best things that pastors and church leaders and others can do is when a question or a different idea comes up and it causes you to shrink back, is to really, you know, ask those deeper questions about, well, what is it about this that's threatening for me, and why is this threatening, you know, and that takes a lot. I mean, but that also takes safety, you know, that takes that safety that people have to experience that on both sides.
It is so complex, and when you start talking about welcoming, I mean, that can even just be making sure that somebody who's new feels like somebody spoke to them. It can be as simple as that. But it's just bringing to mind our conversations last summer about race and privilege, and that it's so complicated because, for example, we absolutely would welcome African American members. We'd love to have many different races and nationalities and ethnic backgrounds among us, but it's very hard to get there if a black family comes and says, well, there aren't very many of us, and so how you transcend that and create a genuinely diverse community where diverse people can feel welcome, I think it's not easy for any church.
Right.
And certainly one in Collier County that is predominantly what it is, it's not easy.
No, yeah, it's not. In that second quote that he raises, where he talks about, that the church is the only institution, is the only society that doesn't exist for the good of its members. I mean, I think that is a profoundly challenging, in some ways flies in the face of, and I would say flies particularly in the face of American culture, particularly American culture today. And so, I mean, to me, this is a self-critical question in the sense that it's something that we as pastors and we as a church, I think, constantly need to ask ourselves and to be holding up against one another, to say, do we exist for ourselves or do we exist for others? It is the proverbial country club church question. Every church I've ever served struggles
And
with
I
it.
will say, I love that we don't exist for our comfort. I still remember somebody saying to me, you know how every Sunday somebody's going to complain about some part of worship or some kind of music. They didn't like that music. And somebody said to me, you should really celebrate that there are people who don't like it because that means we're ministering to somebody else, not you. And I think we forget because we want to feel comfortable. We want our place of safety. We want worship in the way we like it, but we may also be closing the door to somebody else and their life experience. But I do want to give really kudos to this place for the fact that I think many people do understand we don't exist for ourselves.
Yeah.
In that there's such a part of the DNA of this place is being outreach oriented.
Yeah.
It may not always show up on Sunday morning, but it does show up in our volunteers and our commitment to mission.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
And I absolutely believe it, and I think it's really important. I guess I'm in the mood to say things are complicated because
You must have spent time with family recently. No.
because we don't exist for ourselves, and yet at the same time, we do exist to be a place where people can come to be cared for and to be ministered unto. And we have a minister for congregational care because this is supposed to be that safe place where people can come with their questions, with their angst, with their pain, and to build relationships with one another. I'm fond, and I wish I could tell you who really is the person who said it, because I don't know, but the phrase about comforting the afflicted and afflicting the
the
comfortable.
comfortable.
And I think it's that both and that I love to say. But I wouldn't want people to feel like, well, I'm not supposed to get anything out of this for myself, because
Right.
we do. And the spiritual development in our relationship with God, but that constantly drives us to care for people beyond the doors.
We are ministered to so we can minister.
Right.
And I think you're absolutely right, because people they're here for spiritual nurture. I totally get that.
Right.
But when it becomes all about us, that's the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah, and actually, I was excited because I was going to give an answer that Sharon would love, which is it's the both and. Because, in some ways, especially having just completed the search for the next minister for congregational care, is having gotten to spend the time thinking and visiting with both a search committee and a candidate and leadership about what is the vision around congregational care. It is the both and. And that's one of the things that I love about the position on our team, and that is that minister challenges us, helps us care for one another, but then challenges us in response to that care to then go into the world literally and care for others. And so it's actually kind of the dichotomy of that position that I really love, because
I do too.
it is.
why I love the
And
job.
it's interesting to having watched Deb be the person that did it first, live into that, and then to watch Angela come alive when she talks about it as she candidated. So it's been fascinating to kind of look at, because it is the both and it's not wrong to want to be a part of a community that nurtures you.
Right.
I think that's a deep human longing that we really want to be a part of. And so, but I think that there is, the magnifying glass that we have to turn on ourselves that says, but is that what you want your church to be only about?
Right.
And,
And there are churches that get stuck looking inward. And,
Yeah.
and certainly, I would agree with Deb, that is not the story here in any way, but nurturing and empowering.
Yeah. I remember, I think it was like my first spring as senior minister. I was walking through the office one day, and there was, I hope they won't be too embarrassed, but there was a centering prayer group representative, and they had been meeting in the parlor. And on Wednesday afternoons, the youth jazz orchestra from the Phil rehearses here in the sanctuary. Well, as we all know, because we office not far from the sanctuary, they can be pretty loud, talented, but loud. And that doesn't mix with centering prayer. And so I just happened to be walking through when that representative of the group was talking to our receptionist at the time about moving to a different location. But what I loved was, the question was, where can we move so that the jazz orchestra can continue rehearsing? And I just stopped for a moment, and I just said, thank you for asking the right question.
Absolutely.
Because it wasn't, how dare you let those young people come in here and make all that noise. It was, this is a large campus, there are plenty of places we can meet, we'll go somewhere. And I just remember thinking, and to me, that's like a quintessential, that's how I knew it wasn't about us in that
Right.
moment, you know? And
It's a great story.
and it
That's-
was,
it
and
is
I
good.
just, it will always stick with me about, and how much that meant to me. Bishop Curry goes on to talk about ministry in the street, which I loved some of those stories, and how they literally in that area took the gospel of the Bible to the community. And he talks about his own I-thou transformation with a young man named Eddie from the streets, who's a known drug dealer. Again, such a powerful story that I commend to anyone who is reading the book or who will go back and read the book. Just a really powerful story that I would love to spend more time on. But I do want to move us on to chapter 8, because there's a lot of powerful stuff in this as well. So chapter 8, the title is When the Spirit Reworks You, which I thought was a great title. And then the question is that the bishop attempts to answer is, what if love reveals me to be a hypocrite? And I think that's just such an honest question. And I do want to say at the outset, I don't think as much for the two of you, because we've worked together so long and know each other so well that I don't worry about this with you. But I do want to say to those who watch or who might pull this from the archive at some point that so this chapter focuses really on Bishop Curry's what I would call how he really, his views unfold, or how he really grapples with the issues of homosexuality in the church. And, I have the great privilege often of, in this community and other places, of being on panels or talking about these issues in the church. So as I always like to say, you can't ask anything or say anything that's going to offend me or make me angry, nor can anyone in the church. So I just want people to be honest, and, genuine curiosity in respectful ways, I think, is always empowering. And so in 2000, Bishop Curry became the Right Reverend Curry when he was elected Bishop of North Carolina. So he moves from St. James there in Baltimore. I think he says the Episcopal headquarters is in
Raleigh, I
Raleigh, yeah, and where his wife has roots. And he talks about how he's still in boxes, which is usually how these things happen, right? You're just getting settled, and somebody comes in and kind of broadsides you. And he talks about Robert, who is a prominent person in the diocese, who's also an open partnered gay man, comes to see him and asks if he plans to ordain openly gay priests and recognize marriage equality. So again, just to clarify, because it is important, at the time, the Diocese of North Carolina would ordain single people who were celibate or married people who were faithful within the bounds of their marriage. But there was no marriage equality, so no partnered or married priest who was in a same-sex marriage could be ordained. And then you could be essentially a closeted single gay priest. So that was, kind of the world that they were living in at that time. And so he was asked if he planned to change that, and this was already starting to be an issue in North Carolina, Bishop Curry says. So he said he answered honestly that he was open to reviewing these, but that he was not prepared to go against church law, and they had a lot of searching to do on his own. I think I also want to stop and just say kind of points of reference. So the United Church of Christ has ordained openly gay and lesbian people since 1972. As a denomination, we called for marriage equality in 2005, the first mainline denomination to do so. In 2014, the United Church of Christ sued the state of North Carolina over its 2012 constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage, which I'm proud to say later, that lawsuit was actually cited in the marriage equality decision of the Supreme Court. And then marriage equality became the law of the land in 2015. So again, this part of the chapter begins in 2000, so it's a 15-year span that we're dealing with. So I'm just curious, again, he outlines his journey. Do you have a person in your life or a situation or people who challenged your journey or perhaps began your journey?
Okay, there's several along the way, because
Yeah.
40 years of ministry.
Yeah.
I served in Missouri, and you remember Exodus?
Yeah.
International?
Oh, yeah.
There was a very large group of people who were very supportive of them in the Missouri Conference of the United Church of Christ.
Interesting.
And I just
I'm
kind
trying
of
to remember where they were headquartered.
I don't know, but
I knew at one point.
and for
but
those
yeah.
of you who don't know what Exodus, you could probably explain it more. But it was basically trying to reprogram.
Yeah, it's reparative gay therapy.
Yeah.
And they were probably the leading, I would
They
say,
were.
if not they were probably number two, but they were the leading voice, I would say.
And so at that point, I hadn't read anything that would make me look at scripture differently. And so I just listened. I wasn't involved, and I don't remember being like really negative, really positive, just, I need to think about that. Mind you, let me just back up. This is how long ago it was. Part of my church council in my first church asked if I would be willing to do interracial weddings.
Wow.
That's how long ago. This is Missouri. But the interesting piece is they asked because they had church members who were interracial. And so they wanted to make sure I was open.
I was gonna say, yeah.
So there's those two things going on at the same time. So there's
Yeah.
that story. I moved to the Ohio conference, and it was much more open at that point in time. Actually, it was Ohio, then Michigan. So when I finally got to Jupiter, I was asked if I would do a commitment ceremony. And I wasn't sure how, we made decisions as a clergy team. So, and this was asked by a professor at a conservative Christian university in Palm Beach. Because she had done her dissertation on it. She's the first person who had me start reading. And this was, oh my gosh, 25 years
That's
ago.
what I say. I was trying to remember.
It's 25-ish.
Yeah.
And that's when I started reading. She just kept handing me books and handing me books, handing me books. She and her partner ended up breaking up, so I didn't end up doing it. But that also then led us to, as a clergy team in Jupiter, to make a decision in 2015 how we felt about doing same gender marriages. And that was we all agreed on it. And my very first one was my daughter's debate partner's mother. And I did that, and I'm going to go full circle. So I did it on the beach, on the Intercoastal in West Palm Beach. And it was just the couple, the parents on both sides, and me. And we're sitting there, and down here is an African-American family having a picnic. I do it, they kiss, and the African-American family came over and started clapping.
Wow.
So I felt like I came full circle with all of it.
Yeah.
And it really took somebody who's persistent, who said, read this stuff. And I did.
Yeah. And it took the willingness of you to read it and to reflect on it.
Yeah. So that was a long answer, but
No, that's
but
right.
I think an important one.
It's interesting because I was trying to think back to what I thought,
Yeah.
and I really think through high school, for sure, and even in the beginning years of college, I was just ignorant. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't have biased opinions that I was aware of. I mean, I just didn't think about it, and the concept of homosexuality as a characteristic of people. I mean, I was just ignorant. But my third year of college, no, second or third year, I met my husband, who was not yet my husband, but the man who would become my husband, 45 years this year. And his very best friend was a black gay man named Hank. And Hank was our best man, and so my first real introduction was just through loving this person who was my fiance and since husband's best man. So it was much more an experiential thing. It wasn't that I reread something from the Bible. It was just like, well, I didn't think about it. Unfortunately, this is the 1970s, and Hank was one of the many people who died of AIDS. But that was sort of, my theology grows out of my experience in that sense. And it was later in seminary, thinking through some of the theological issues and being able to say to people, no, that is not what the Bible says. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
And to have to work through it with some other people who had questions and stuff. But the time I most remember talking about it was maybe 30 years ago with very good friends of my parents and my parents, and hearing, so we're talking a generation, these friends are actually older than my parents, so and now deceased, but they're wrestling with it, and faithful church members who are trying to figure it out, and I at that point was just kind of listening in.
Yeah.
There's one more story I want to just tell, and I think this had a whole lot to do with my openness, is my mother was always a very progressive Catholic, and I have a cousin who's gay, and he and his partner were adopting a baby girl, and they wanted to do a baby shower for them, and nobody on one side of the family would come because it was wrong to do that, and it's wrong to be gay. And my mother said, well, our side of the family is going to do the shower, and all of you will send presents. And we all did.
I love that.
This is slightly off topic, but you're talking about interracial marriages makes me think when I graduated from seminary, the church I went to serve on the staff asked me how I felt about mixed marriages.
Mixed what?
Protestant and Catholic. Because there were so many people in the church.
I was going to say, the wild, crazy, people. I'm curious. We were talking about earlier when we were talking about Martin Buber, but having gone to seminary in different times, were there conversations in your seminary training about biblical interpretation and around sexuality or sexual orientation? You went to crazy liberal.
I went to Berkeley, California.
Well, so did you, but just on the different coast. Yeah, I guess that's true.
My professors, we did, and that was the beginning of my just pondering it.
The other place where it came up for me to think about and deal with was in a course on counseling.
Oh, true. That too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Well, thank you both for sharing that. Curry references Howard Thurman, who said that struggle for convergence between head and heart is the struggle for spiritual maturity, which I loved.
Absolutely.
I love that. And again, I was not familiar with that, so I was like writing that down on a separate thing recording that because I thought, ooh, I'm going to commit that. Do you recognize a struggle that occurred for you over issues around the full inclusion of LGBTQ persons in the church? I mean, you talked about your journeys, but you're talking about, you spent the majority of your ministry at Jupiter, and I'm not trying to call Jupiter out, that's not fair, but I'm just saying, was there something that arose at Jupiter? Was there ever a time, if I remember right, I don't know, I don't think that Jupiter's ONA, but...
It isn't, and it's not, and I think it was their own journey of figuring it out. I mean, we had a lot of gay couples in our church.
Well, I was going to say, I
remember,
don't think of Jupiter as a church that would be unfriendly or unwelcoming either, but they're not ONA. Yeah.
And I still remember, it was so funny, we had a young couple, and they, two women were bringing their baby for baptism, and some older member said, well, those are two women. And I said, yeah. And she goes, oh, okay.
Yeah, just kind of had to process it out loud.
It just had to process it. And so it was, I will say that most of the gay couples in the church were pretty closeted in their own worlds.
Sure.
Because of what they did for a living or whatever. And so they were comfortable with not, I mean, the ones that I had conversations, they're comfortable with us not them being closeted.
Sure.
And so I think it's changed since then, but.
At one point, this is a dated statistic, and I need to see if I can update it, but at one point there were, it was less than 10% of gay and lesbian people were out in all aspects of their life. Family, church,
and that's
friends,
what I would
professionally. So it doesn't surprise me to hear you say that.
Yeah, they weren't, but I don't know, because
like I said,
the ones that I knew were comfortable with it being kind of quiet.
Yeah.
Because they were quiet.
Yeah, I mean, don't ask, don't tell as a policy of the government is rooted in some ways in the internalized homophobia of gay and lesbian people. So, I mean, in some ways it made sense. Yeah. I'm not saying it was a just policy. I'm just saying it kind of made sense.
No,
in some ways.
I think it's another step in the journey.
Sure, no, and that's why I was asking the question is because so often the journeys that individuals take are reflective of the corporate journeys that are happening around them. That's why I'm just curious if there were, either entities, and you spent so much time in education, but also education at as you've defined it, a conservative religious college.
Yes, it is a conservative religious college, but it's also a liberal arts college.
True, yeah.
So there was a tension between. And I think I've said this before, but their mantra was all truth is God's truth. And so the sense of exploring and thinking and asking questions to find truth was very much valued. There were certainly still people who were not there in terms of fully accepting gay and lesbian people or students. There were also faculty who were very accepting, and students found them and knew who they could go to and be open. What your question made me think about was actually my home church, which I've talked about being very inclusive as I was growing up. I was not there at the time, but my parents still were when there was a decision about calling a minister. And there was always, calling the next minister, there was always a group within the church that was more theologically conservative, and the church was dwindling, so it was not a lot of people, but when they voted to call a woman who was not gay or lesbian, but was very much an ally and an outspoken ally and a person who was out in parades and other things, that group of very conservative people left the church. Over that.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about your college, I mean, where you were teaching, because, I don't know that I would have described my undergraduate experience like this necessarily, but, that was really my experience was, the number of out students. I mean, it was a small student body, probably around 1,000, liberal arts college, small liberal arts college, but like the number of out gay students is, literally probably 5. When I was there. But, my siblings all went to the same school. And by the time my sister graduated 10 years later, my family used to joke it was like a gay pride parade, but it wasn't, I don't think, that the number of gay students changed. It was that the atmosphere
Right.
where people felt safe, where they could be themselves and be open, had changed. And there's a lot of factors that contributed to that, for which I'm eternally grateful.
Well, and I was in the education department, and many of my colleagues were retired educators, like they've been the principal or superintendent, and then they decided to become
Oh, right.
a professor after they retired at 50 or something. And that made us as a group much more progressive than faculty in, say, the business department or
Sure.
other
Well, and again, that's how I would describe my undergrad. Very similar. Again, different now than when I was there. A significant turning point that Bishop Curry points to and really, in my opinion, spends quite a bit of time on, which I found interesting, but it was also a turning point for the entire Episcopal Church, was the election of Bishop V. Gene Robinson as the presiding bishop of New Hampshire, first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church. I've been fortunate to meet Bishop Robinson a few times. The first was actually not long after he became bishop, and he preached at my former congregation. We had a picture. I don't know if we're going to be able to show it or not. Oh, yep. You'll see Bishop Robinson aged. I have not, but this was Bishop Robinson and I together. But what's interesting was Bishop Robinson's election was a point of deep division, as I mentioned. And I remember when I was in seminary and I was discerning about leaving the Methodist Church, I was visiting with an Episcopal seminary professor. He was not a priest, but interestingly, his spouse is. And I was talking about perhaps going to the Episcopal Church. And I just will never forget, and he and I are still friends to this day, but he said, Dawson, I would love to see you in the Episcopal Church, but in all honesty, it's a firestorm right now, and I just can't advise doing it. And I remember thinking, oh, okay. But again, the story ends well, because that's part of how I found the United Church of Christ. Bishop Robinson continues to be a symbol for inclusion. At the service that was held for Matthew Shepard to inter his cremains at the National Cathedral in late 2018, Bishop Robinson spoke and gave the eulogy. But Bishop Robinson spoke of what he had personally endured and how the Shepard family had supported him, and how Matthew Shepard had also been a symbol for him. And I think we are able to show a quick clip of that sermon as well.
Small ways. 5 years after Matt's death, I was consecrated a bishop for the Diocese of New Hampshire. And just before I strapped on my bulletproof vest for my consecration, someone hand-delivered a note from Judy Shepard, which I carried with me. And it said, I know Matthew will be smiling down upon you tomorrow. Now, Judy...
A very poignant moment in his eulogy during that service. And again, Bishop Robinson took many threats to his life and to his husband's life and his family's life over that election, and Bishop Curry speaks to that courage. I've always sensed, from my perspective, that the parallels of debate that happen over the ordination of gay and lesbian people are very similar to the debates that the church has had over the ordination of women, which in the Methodist Church has just passed, I think it was 57, 58 years. The United Church of Christ has been doing it since the 1870s. Do you agree, disagree? What do you see
I
parallels
think
and
the similarities are
differences?
how Scripture is used or misused. That's the parallel. it's a little different in that with women, there's a physical and obvious thing that people notice. Gays and lesbians, you might not know. Um, and I would say, so I don't, it's not better or worse, it just is. I remember
Yeah,
early
it's no
in,
contest. I'm just
no,
just curious.
early in ministry, I remember having to read all the books to be able to justify being a woman in pastoral ministry. I still remember my first internship. I was wearing jeans at a rummage sale, and somebody said, "Well, you're a minister, a woman minister. I can't believe you're wearing jeans." I mean, like that kind of stuff, just silliness. And I remember doing seminars for people about how to interpret scripture on this. And the good news is that it faded over time. So similar, but maybe not. Maybe it was more similar a long time ago. What do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think another similarity is the sense of genetics, that it's part of who we are,
Yeah.
not what we choose.
Right.
And so the givenness of that, I think one of the differences is that part of the issue around women was real lines about roles. And men do this and women do this, and never the twain shall meet. And I don't think it was that gays do this and straights do that. So it was different. I would certainly agree in terms of interpretation of scripture. Curry talks about the ordination of the Episcopal women in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And I was just
It was the 11, right?
right, the 11. And I was
Philadelphia
trying to
11.
remember the year, but it was in the 70s, and I remember reading the book about that as I was going into ministry. I think it was A
remember
Priest
it too.
Forever.
It was a great book.
It was a great book, and certainly I was inspired by the women who went before me, and like Deb, went into places where there hadn't been women before me. And
Oh, every
mean,
church I've ever been in, I was the first woman.
Yeah.
Sometimes,
Well, except for here.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Except for here.
this is the first.
right? Well, it's interesting too that people sometimes there are hurtful things and mean things and all that, and then sometimes, like you said, there's just silly things. Like I remember going to a deacons meeting. In fact, at the church I went to, they still had deacons and deaconesses.
Oh, wow.
And going to the meeting of deacons, and somebody saying, "Well, the deacons have certainly gotten to be better looking." And there was one man who was just an ally for me, we kind of rolled our eyes at each other, and it was like, okay, I'm not going to respond, but this is ridiculous.
Yeah. I remember, I can't remember if I've shared this in this venue. I think I've shared it with the two of you, but my aunt, who's a recently retired clergy person, and she talks about how in her early years of ministry, she was so grateful for clerical collars. She doesn't wear them now and hasn't in a long time, but because of some of the expectations and roles and really, because she was also serving in deep East Texas for a time, the need for authority wore clerical collars, because she talks about how, like, she would go, I think she talks about a Rotary Club meeting or something, and to give the prayer, and it was, well, the pastor from the Methodist Church is supposed to be here to give the invocation, but we don't see them, and it was like, well, actually, I'm here,
Oh,
kind
yeah,
of thing.
that reminds me, I've been challenged by security guards in hospital parking lots for parking, clergy parking.
In the clergy parking, yeah. So that kind of stuff. And so she talks about how, especially early in her ministry, she was so grateful for those, just those symbols of our office that we sometimes can utilize. And interestingly, I've used those symbols in things like protests or marches or things that were earlier in my career that where I needed that physical reminder for someone else, not for me, but for someone else, in a way that I don't necessarily as much now. I could still utilize that, I guess, if I needed to. But
Yeah, and I literally only have a clergy collar for marches or protests.
Yeah.
I've never worn one otherwise.
yeah,
I
that's the
probably
only thing
could
I've
have,
done.
but I never felt like I wanted to do that. But everyone,
Yeah, to each their own. But yeah.
As a Baptist, I never even had one, so.
Well, I remember the first time I got one was in my previous church, and I literally walked in that day and had to ask a colleague, I've never seen these. What do I do with it? I mean, like, because my dad's never had one, and things like
Well,
that.
you're talking about parking, early on, somebody gave me, you know how there's like
Oh, those
things
placards,
that you
yeah.
stick in the car
Clergy?
that said clergywoman emergency.
Oh,
I mean, it was really a double entendre. I mean, it was a joke when it was given to me, but it was like, so this is, I can park and be allowed in.
I really like that, though. I think that's great. As we begin to close, one of the things that struck me as I was reading this and I was reflecting on the communal life of our congregation is I have sensed that one of the fastest growing communities within our congregation, within our church, are parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends, allies of LGBTQ plus people who want to belong to a church where they know their family members and friends would not only be accepted but also celebrated. And so, as a pastor, what would you say to that specific community who are a part of our church? Who I think sometimes, this is my experience, that sometimes it will be a year, 3 years, 5 years sometimes, until I find out that they have an LGBTQ relative or friend, and then suddenly things make sense in a different way for me. And that may not be how you experience it, but sometimes it is for me.
you know, I might respond a little bit differently. I'm always struck by conversations with my children's friends who have a lot of LGBTQ friends, and they often say they won't go to church because of the stance of churches towards their friends. And my kids will regularly say, oh, then you just have to find a church like my parents' church, or a United Church of Christ. They kind of get it. And people are introduced to it because people of that generation, generally speaking,
Absolutely.
won't go to a church if they're thinking about this, that it's not welcoming.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely been my experience.
I have the same experience that you do, that it's often not until much later that I find that out. But thinking about what I would say, part of me, just because as I think about some of who those people are, I want to say thank you for being part of this church, because you give in so many ways, quite unrelated to, who your son and daughter or nieces and nephews are. I mean, I just know some wonderful people for whom that's the case, and I'm glad that they chose us.
It's a place where I think they want to know that if their family is visiting, that they can come to church and not sit on the edge of their seat worrying about whether their family's going to be welcome. And I think people really know that here.
Yeah, and I do think that's a very powerful gift. And I just remember, as many in this congregation know, after I came out publicly, my father, under a series of circumstances, had to leave a church that he was serving. And before that happened, I was dating a guy that we took the weekend off and went to see my parents. And I remember asking my dad if it was okay to bring my boyfriend to church, and because I said, I don't want to cause more problems for you. And my dad said, I am not going to have a conversation about whether you can bring someone who means something to you to my church. Like, we're not doing that. And so, I think about that for families who come to our church, that they don't want to have those conversations with their families. And I don't want them to have those conversations, because we, again, going back to almost the beginning of our conversation, we want to be a church that is a safe place for all families, whatever that means. I was thinking about like interracial marriage, Protestant, Catholic, around here, I've done some, interfaith weddings, Jewish and Christians, and we see them at holidays, and actually a couple that I can think of worship here most Sundays, actually. But, so I just think about whatever safety means for people. So
Well, and I just want to say, because hearing again about your dad, but also people that Curry describes, we've talked in different books about the pain that the church has inflicted, and it makes me want to weep for what the church has done. And not this church, but the church.
right, the Church Universal, yeah. And that's why I think we're so committed as a team and as a congregation of being an open and affirming congregation to be a place that doesn't do that to others and works hard. Well, as we come to our conclusion, I want to offer this as a blessing. As we think about some of those painful things, I want to think about St. Francis, who calls us to do good things. Let's join our hearts. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. Thank you again for being with us tonight. We look forward to welcoming you to worship this coming Sunday, and then to join us again next Wednesday evening. Have a great rest of your night.